The 2018 tornado season in North America had one particular feature that stood out, and that was the fact that the strongest tornado of the season occurred way further north and way later into the season than you would expect. I'm not talking about this particular tornado just being north of Tornado Alley in the USA either. Well, I mean, I am, but this one didn't even occur within the USA at all. We had to go all the way up north to the Canadian province of Manitoba for this one. Even then, once we get there, we still need to keep going north until we find the small rural town of Alonsa, Manitoba. It's August 3rd, 2018, and the US was having its first year of no violent tornadoes, these are tornadoes classed at EF4 or above intensity, for the first time since records began in the 1950s. For Canada, however, they were seeing an above average number of tornadoes, and it had been 11 years since a violent tornado had hit the country, which was the Ely, Manitoba tornado back in 2007. Things were about to change for Canada though, and the small town of Alonsa, Manitoba was about to become the site of Canada's first violent tornado in over a decade. In the days leading up to the outbreak on August 3rd, the synoptic scale pattern across both Alberta and Saskatchewan was favourable for severe convective storms, and they ended up producing large hail in both of these provinces. This was the same pattern that would ultimately spawn the tornado in Alonsa. On the day of the tornado, August 3rd, multiple severe weather outbreaks occurred in southern Manitoba. Whilst an upper-level jet moved over southern Manitoba, a northwestern upper-level ridge was pushing eastward into northwestern Ontario. An associated surface low continued to track east from southern Saskatchewan, and by 7 PM local time an occluded front that extended south from the surface low to the US border was present. Alonsa was just east of this boundary. Thanks to warm moist southerly flow at the surface ahead of the front, the Cape value in the Parkland region reached 4,000 joules per kilogram, a level that was considered high. The development of supercell thunderstorms was imminent, and tornadoes even more so as the wind shear was reaching 40 knots. The Woodlands weather radar picked up a supercell at 8:20 PM local time, which had discreetly developed in southern central Manitoba. Over the course of several scans beginning at 8:20 PM, they showed a velocity coupler associated with a mesocyclone, a strong reflectivity core, and a Hawk echo. This was present on scans until 8:40 PM local time. Given the data from the weather radar and eyewitness footage at around 8:30 PM, it was estimated that the EF4 that affected Alonsa, Manitoba, touched down at 8:20 PM local time.
A devastating tornado tore through the community of Alonsa, Manitoba Friday night.
The track for this tornado was nowhere near as erratic as the F5 tornado that impacted Ely over a decade earlier. After the tornado had touched down, it headed in a northeasterly direction, travelling across a lot of wide open fields to begin with. At this point, the tornado wasn't very strong at all and was just getting going. It didn't have a rating for most of its travel across land due to the fact that it was mainly impacting vegetation and open fields for a good long while. You have to remember that Alonsa is a very rural town that's almost 200 kilometers away from Winnipeg, the closest major city. The path that this tornado took was consistent and was basically a straight line to the northeast. The first piece of destruction that it caused occurred near a main north-south road. It hit a house which luckily had been abandoned long before the storm hit. The house was of older construction and the roof and most exterior walls were removed from atop the basement walls. Closer inspection of the property revealed that the sheathing material and wall base plates were rotten or rotting. A refrigerator that they believed came from the house or near outbuilding was found 80 meters to the east. The tornado, having crossed the previously mentioned road, continued its path across more fields and vegetation, intensifying as it did. The next structure to take a hit from the tornado, which was now believed to be at its most intense, was a house and several farm outbuildings. All of these had been completely swept away, and various vehicles and farm equipment had been flung a significant distance from where it is believed they originally stood. The large trees that were close to the buildings were ripped out along with their roots and tossed over 10 meters away. Similar to the abandoned building from earlier, a chest freezer was found 200 meters away from the house. As mentioned earlier, the house was completely swept off its foundation, but despite being built in the 1950s, it did appear to have been firmly anchored to the foundation. Strangely though, the same couldn't be said for the two additions to the house that were built later on that were classed as having a poor connection. It's believed that the failure of the house's structural integrity originated here. There were also several barns and outhouses that suffered a similar fate to the house. The damage assessment at this site is what ultimately led to the eventual rating of this tornado as an EF4. Unfortunately, this house wasn't the only thing to be impacted here. The home's owner, 77-year-old Jack Fury, was at home when the tornado struck. Reports indicated that he was caught completely off guard by the tornado and tragically lost his life. But the tornado's path didn't end there, as its trajectory put it on course to hit yet more buildings, but at a slightly reduced intensity. This could, however, have been due to the building in question having received a hit more from the northern edge of the tornado's damage path rather than a direct hit. Regardless of that, it still suffered from shingles being removed and major damage to the vinyl siding. A shed that was present on the property was removed from its foundation slab after its anchor bolts were found intact but bent. A nearby neighbouring house wouldn't be so lucky though, and appeared to take a more direct hit compared to its neighbour. The roof was removed and 3 of the exterior walls collapsed inwards on the property, enclosing a large open living space. The interior walls of the house did however remain standing. The elderly couple who owned the house were present at the time, and they took shelter underneath a dining table as they watched the entire roof lift off and walls collapse inwards. They were able to come away from the ordeal with their lives, but did suffer injuries that required them to be admitted to the hospital. The house, which was built in 1993, appeared to have a lot of low-quality anchoring connections. A log cabin and several farm structures that were also on the property were removed from their foundations due to not having been well anchored. At this point, the tornado was rapidly approaching Lake Manitoba, but unfortunately there was one more residential property between it and the lake. It was a large property with various buildings that took varying levels of damage. The main structure itself was fairly new and seemed to have no visual damage, whilst the cottage further north on the property was completely removed from its foundations. After discussions with residents, it was revealed that the cottage was originally built in 1963 and had a basement added to it at a later date. Once the basement had been added, they just moved the cottage atop the basement walls but never actually secured it to the top of them. Finally, the tornado passed through a campground, overturning several camper trailers and severely damaging others. There were also several cottages destroyed in this area. One log cabin was able to escape with minor exterior damage, but it had been pushed off its piers in the process. Luckily, everyone in the campground saw the tornado coming and were able to seek shelter away from the tornado's track, allowing them to escape injury. A lot of debris were found washed up on the shore of Lake Manitoba, and several vehicles and trailers which were believed to have been from the campground were found inside the lake itself. From here, the tornado completed its track across land as it reached Lake Manitoba, and finally dissipated at an unknown point over the lake. In total, the tornado travelled 16 kilometres, reached a peak width of 800 metres, and was estimated to be on the ground for about 20 to 40 minutes. So, the rating. Canada switched to the enhanced Fujita scale in April 2013, and as I've mentioned before already, this tornado was rated at EF4 intensity. Given the vast amount of open fields it crossed, it's not known how long it sustained its EF4 intensity for, and out of the 7 sites that damage analysis was taken from, there was only 1 site that actually suffered from EF4 intensity damage. It does seem to be that for most of this tornado's life it was at EF1 to EF3 intensity, and by the time it reached the lake it had diminished significantly down to EF0 to EF1 intensity. Environment Canada has estimated that the peak wind speeds for this tornado were 275 km per hour, putting it on the low end of the EF4 scale. The estimated damage caused by this tornado was at the time around $2 million Canadian dollars. The Alonsa, Manitoba tornado ended up being the strongest tornado in Canada since the Eli, Manitoba tornado back in 2007, and it was the first tornado in Canada since 2011 to claim a life. Given the number of reports that I've seen around there being no warnings received for this tornado, it is astonishing that the death toll wasn't higher, especially with the amount of mobile homes and trailers in the damage path. Delving into that more, a number of residents claim that they didn't receive an alert for this tornado, and Jack's family members believe that it is one of the main reasons that he is no longer with them. It seems that Bell had done some upgrades to the cell towers in the area back in May, and since then the cell service had been basically non-existent for the residents of that area. Despite countless complaints to Bell, they were always just told that it was being worked on and would be restored soon. Asham, a resident of Alonsa, told CBC that he never received a warning on his phone, just on the TV. He also stated that the town counts on cell service for our emergency services, so this thing is pretty devastating right in the middle of no phone service. Environment Canada did clarify that they sent out a severe thunderstorm watch for the area on Friday morning, and at 8 PM, 20 minutes before the tornado touched down, they upgraded it to a severe thunderstorm warning. They also sent out a tornado warning at 8:20 PM right as the tornado began. From the news articles that I've read around this, residents of Alonsa, and especially Jack's family, are putting the blame firmly on Bell's lack of coverage in the area for the tornado going unwarned for everyone. I don't think Bell's responses of "we're working on remedying the problem" are good enough, considering they knew about the problem for 2 months before the tornado hit, and even said the same thing again just a few weeks prior to the tornado. As well as having to deal with the aftermath and damage of a tornado, the campground that was near Lake Manitoba was having problems with looters coming in on foot and via ATV, and security officers had to be hired to help combat the problem. Fortunately, with there still being a few residents present on the campgrounds, the looters were being chased off quickly, and as far as was known, nothing was actually taken by them. There was some good news though, as more than a dozen volunteers had been in the affected area to help with recovery efforts. They were even able to offer the residents both shelter and food, a much needed relief for them, I'm sure. This tornado unfortunately had a lot of first since aspects to it. First violent tornado of the 2018 season, first violent tornado in Canada since 2007, and the first deadly tornado in Canada since 2011. Did Bell's failure to provide adequate cell service to the area lead to the tragic nature of this tornado? Possibly, but it's hard to say and I wouldn't like to speculate. I think the bigger problem is that Canada just doesn't take tornadoes as seriously as the USA does, and issuing a tornado warning as a tornado touches down is far from ideal. Why were Environment Canada unable to issue watches and tornado probabilities earlier like the US does? Even today, in 2024, they don't seem to be all that good at it either. We all know tornadoes are hard to predict, but a 23% success rate for tornado warnings since 2019 highlights the amount of work that needs to be done in Canada. I really struggled to even find any information about this tornado. I realised with how rural Alonsa is, it wasn't going to be as widely covered, but there doesn't seem to be any mention of this tornado on the Environment Canada website. On top of that, news articles were sparse with their information. It was only thanks to the Northern Tornadoes project and an assessment paper that they wrote on the wind speeds and damage path that occurred that I was able to go so in depth for this video. As usual, please do let me know in the comments if you have any recollection of this tornado or if it impacted you in any way. Do you wish that Canada was doing more to predict tornadoes better, rather than just the warning being sent out when they touch down? If you enjoyed this video and want to see more about Canada's tornadoes and severe weather events, then please do consider subscribing and liking this video. It really helps me out, and I appreciate every one of you. Thank you to everyone that watched today's video, and I will see you in the next one. From here, the tornado completed its track across land as it reached Lake Manitoba, and finally the tornado travelled 16 kilometers. You giant